We can get started and people can keep coming in, but welcome everyone. I'm Julia. I'm the programs coordinator for Beth Meyer. Thanks all for coming to this Monday night speaker series event. So just before we get started, I want to ask everyone to mute themselves during the presentation, and the last 10 or so minutes we'll have some question answer where you can unmute to ask questions. So I want to welcome Mark Werner, who's going to talk about his book and his time in Israel. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Julia.
And you want me to share the video?
Yes, please.
All right.
I'm only one call away. I'll be there to save the day. Superman got nothing on me. I'm only one call away.
One unit has become legendary, the Israeli medical unit.
We did everything that we can to be as fast as possible on ground.
Israel's only the world's 152nd biggest country, but it's always one of the first to send disaster relief all over the globe.
No matter where you go, no, you're not alone. I'm only one call away.
The earthquake in Haiti.
I'll be there to save the day.
The tsunami in Japan.
Superman got nothing on me.
The typhoon in the Philippines.
I'm only one call away.
Save a Child's Heart brings children with life-threatening heart defects to Israel for cardiac care.
Save a Child's Heart brings children from all over the world.
From Ethiopia and Iraq.
From Syria.
Tanzania.
From Sudan.
Gaza and Palestinian territories, even when these countries are actually at war with Israel.
Save a Child's Heart volunteers and doctors transport and treat these kids in Israel free of charge.
I just wanna see you smile. No matter where you go, you know you're not alone. I'm only one call away.
Innovation Africa brings Israeli technology to rural African villages. Volunteers have built schools,
Superman got nothing on me.
medical clinics,
I'm only one call away.
And change the lives of over 750,000 people by providing tools for solar power and clean water.
When you're weak, I'll be strong. I'm gonna keep holding on.
Israel goes beyond its borders to save a life.
Change the world.
Make a difference. Israel is more than just a country.
Israel.
It's people helping other people.
When you feel like hope is gone, just run into my arms. I'm only one call away.
The Israelis came from the other side of the world.
I'll be there to save the day.
No one except the Israeli hospital has taken any of our patients.
Superman got nothing on me. I'm only one. I'm only one call away. I'll be there to save the day. Superman got nothing on me. I'm only one call away. I'm only one call away.
Thank you, Julia.
Welcome.
My name is Mark Werner. I'm here to talk about my book, which I'll mention in a minute. But let me just mention, if this is the first time I'm giving this presentation, please bear with me. This is my practice run for future presentations, and I've just put this together, so please have patience with me. That video is very stirring, isn't it? It shows that Israel sends volunteers all over the world to help people in need. And it makes us proud to hear about that. Isn't it time for us to volunteer for Israel, to help Israel's needs? My book is called A Passion for Israel, Adventures of a Sarel Volunteer. And it tells the story of my journey that led me to volunteer on Israeli military bases for many years. And it's a volunteer opportunity that's available to anyone who wants to do it. My journey starts in an unusual place, although I didn't realize it was unusual growing up there. I grew up on the closest thing to a moshav in North America. For those of you who don't know what a moshav is, it's a close cousin of a kibbutz. It's an agricultural cooperative farming colony. My moshav was located on the outskirts of a small town called Vineland, New Jersey, in South Jersey. My moshav was founded in the 1880s by the same European Jewish philanthropist who founded the kibbutzim and moshavim in Israel at the same time. On my moshav, all the Jews were farmers. And on my moshav, when I was growing up, all the Jews my parents' age were Holocaust survivors. And everyone that I knew of my parents' age had a number on their arm from the concentration camp they'd been in. The exception was my dad. My dad hadn't survived the Holocaust in a concentration camp. He had survived as a member of a large and successful Jewish fighting unit in occupied Poland, in the forests of Poland. They had inflicted a lot of damage on the German military, but more importantly, had saved a lot of Jews. And he wrote a book about it called Fighting Back. So growing up, I grew up in a very Zionistic environment, not because the people I grew up with talked about the Holocaust. They didn't. It was, in fact, a verboten topic. The rule from my parents' generation is don't scare the children. Don't talk about bad things. So they didn't talk about the Holocaust, but they talked about Israel a lot, because my parents' generation believed, and I believe, that if Israel had existed in 1939, there would have been no Holocaust. And my parents believed, and I believe, that it's the existence of the state of Israel that prevents another Holocaust. Think about it. Israel's existed for 72 years, since 1948. And over that 72-year period, there's been no mass persecution of Jews anywhere around the world. That's not normal, unfortunately, for the history of the Jewish people. If you go back before World War II and try to find a 72-year period where Jews around the world were allowed to live in peace, you'd be hard-pressed to find that long of a period. And if you ask a senior Israeli officer, not just a low-level soldier, but a senior officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, what the mission of the IDF is, his or her first answer will be to defend the country, to defend Israel. But if you press them on it, they'll say, and their mission is also to defend Jews around the world. So if it's the existence of the state of Israel that prevents another Holocaust or mass persecution of Jews, I asked myself in growing up, what can I do to strengthen Israel? So in becoming an adult, I joined various pro-Israel organizations like AIPAC and JNF and FIDF, and I contributed money to these organizations, and that was fine. But at a certain point, writing another check to another worthy organization just didn't seem to be enough for me. I wanted to do something more and more personal. Then I came across a program called Volunteers for Israel, or SAREL. It places civilian volunteers on Israeli military bases to do the work. And I decided to try it. And I remember on the flight over thinking to myself, I must be crazy. I don't have any military background. I don't even speak Hebrew. I speak this much Hebrew. But when I got there, I discovered I was not alone. There were lots of people like me. In fact, 4,000 people a year volunteer through this program to work on Israeli military bases. Both men and women, both Jews and non-Jews from countries all over the world. And in fact, over the history of the program, over 150,000 people have volunteered to do this. So I tried it that year and I liked it. And a year later, I came back and tried it again and I loved it. And I fell in love with doing this volunteer program and I got hooked on volunteering. So for each of the past 18 years, I volunteered on an Israeli military base. It's a wonderful experience because you feel like you're making a personal contribution to the state of Israel. Now, this experience also takes you out of your comfort zone because you live in the barracks with the soldiers, you eat in the mess hall with the soldiers, you work side by side with them, and of course, you wear the uniform. Now, the work that we do is work which if we didn't do it, a soldier would have to do it. What type of work, you might ask? Very basic work, not sexy stuff, okay? We're packing military supplies, we're packing medical supplies, we're cleaning, we're painting, we're doing whatever they ask us to do that a soldier would otherwise do. Now, I'm told that a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I brought along a few pictures to show people, to explain what the work is about. So, Julia, if you could put up the first slide. Okay, this is a picture of a four-person work team on a base called Matzrop, which is a medical supply base. And some of you may recognize the young woman on the left. She's a former member of Beth Or, Temple Beth Or here in Raleigh. The other thing you notice is that you don't have to be a big, strong guy to do this work. You just have to be able to follow directions and count, and you can do work on this base. This base is very important because it's the only base that packages medical supplies for the entire Israeli military. So it's crucial. And the bulk of the work that's done in this base is done by the volunteers. In fact, the base cannot operate without volunteers. But in addition to supplying the medical supplies used by the entire Israeli military, this base supplies medical supplies for humanitarian purposes. So for instance, you've probably heard about the Syrian civil war that went on for about 5 years. And the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, intentionally bombed the civilians in the rebel-held territories to kill as many civilians as possible. And then he bombed their hospitals so they couldn't be treated for their wounds. What Israel did is Israel opened up, and it was an open secret, not a secret, Israel opened up a hospital, a military hospital, on its border with Syria, with the rebel-held part of Syria, and welcomed all comers. Anybody from Syria who was hurt and injured and needed medical treatment, the hospital took them in for free. And the medical supplies that the hospital used were packed on this base by the volunteers. Another humanitarian purpose of our medical supplies, you just saw in the video those overseas disaster relief teams that Israel sends to places that have earthquakes and tsunamis and things. The medical supplies those teams use are packed on this base by the volunteers. So the work that we do, the work that the volunteers do on this base is very important both for Israel and Israel's humanitarian efforts. Julie, can I have the second slide? Julia?
1 second, it's not letting.
Okay. Oh, you skipped one, but could you go back?
Yes.
Okay. This slide shows the most common work that the volunteers do. We're packing gear for the soldiers. In this case, these three volunteers in the foreground, two of whom are husband and wife from Toronto, they're packing uniforms. They're checking in the packing uniforms. They fold them up if they're okay. They tie them up, they box them up, and they're sent out to the field. If you can notice in the background of the picture, there are soldiers in this warehouse. They're doing pretty much the same thing. So if these three volunteers weren't here at this table, they'd have to assign 3 soldiers to do the same work. But this is very common work that the volunteers do. Next slide, please. Other work that we do. Some of you may recognize my handsome young son, David. He volunteered with me, and we were on a communications repair base here. And what he's holding up in his hand, that device, is the base for a tank antenna. And it takes 5 or 10 minutes of instruction, and you know how to put it together. In fact, if you notice on the left-hand side of the picture, there are several that he's already put together. The work that we do on this base requires some instruction, but it requires just an ability to use your hands, and it's not complicated stuff. And somewhere in Israel, there are tanks using tank antenna bases that my son has put together. Next slide, please. Okay, here I'm sitting inside what's called an armored personnel carrier. It's empty. This is looking from the back of the armored personnel carrier. An armored personnel carrier looks like a tank, but without the cannon on the front, and it's designed to carry soldiers into battle. It carries 8 soldiers with all their gear. And what the volunteers do is when the gear inside the tank, inside the armored personnel carrier needs to be replaced, the volunteers take out the old gear and package in the new gear. And right now we've just emptied out this armored personnel carrier before we've actually put anything in it. Those slots to the right, on the right of the picture, are slots for ammunition cases. Okay, next slide. There's a lot of work we do outside. Here, my son and I are filling sandbags on a base near the Lebanese, an outpost base near the Lebanese border. And when I say near the Lebanese border, we're about 40 yards from Lebanon at this point. And it wasn't just the 2 of us. We had an entire team of volunteers, about 15 people, filling sandbags. And on that day, we filled between 600 and 800 sandbags until we ran the base out of sandbags. Now you ask, is this important work? Yes, it's important work. The next slide will show you why it's important work. These are the trenches along the outskirts of the outpost bases. And as you can see, this is where the Israeli soldiers have to patrol to watch the border. And as you can see on the sides at eye level on the trenches, they've placed these sandbags at head sort of or eye level. And it's to protect the soldiers from snipers, from the Hezbollah gunmen, which are very close by to this outpost base. So these sandbags are very important for protecting the soldiers. So the work that the volunteers do is important. Next slide, please. Now, sometimes they ask if anyone wants to volunteer for heavy duty work. And these two volunteers, myself and Gary Barron, who you may recognize as a member of our Jewish community, volunteered for heavy work, and they gave us heavy work. They had us moving artillery shells. These are 155 millimeter artillery shells. We were putting them on wooden pallets, packaging them, and they were forklifted to warehouses. But people can do whatever work they want to do. So they give you work that's compatible with your abilities to handle it. And if you don't like the work, you tell them and they just change it. In this case, Gary and I volunteered for this heavy work. Doesn't look like a lot. There's only about a half dozen shells there. But if you go to the next slide, it gives you an idea of the scope of the work that day. This is the warehouse full of artillery shells. So we had a lot to move that day. But it was good work. It was work we asked for and we enjoyed it. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, this slide is not to show about work, it's to make a different kind of point. This is my son and I, who volunteers with me once in a while on a base. And the point I want to make here is that some of you know me and know that I spent most of my career traveling. I was on the road most of the time, didn't get to spend a lot of time with my family and as much time as I wanted to with my son. And so I thought it might be a good bonding experience to volunteer together with my son for 3 weeks on a military base. And it turned out to be an excellent bonding experience. We had a great time. And David liked it so much that he's done it not once or twice, he's done it 5 times with me. It's an opportunity to create sort of shared remembrances of interesting things that you can talk about for years later. And I've seen many, many other parents with their sons and daughters, or grandparents with their grandchildren, or uncles and aunts with their nieces and nephews do this together, or husbands and wives. And so I highly recommend, if anyone considers it, do it with someone else that you know, because it creates great bonding and great shared experiences. Okay, let's dispense with the slides for a bit, if we could, Julia, and I'll talk a little bit more about my book. The work that the volunteers do benefits Israel in 2 ways. The first way is the way I've just shown you, which is the work that gets done takes the place of a soldier, and it frees up soldiers to do more serious work in defending the country. Or it allows Israel to call up fewer reservists. But there's a second benefit. It's more of an intangible benefit, but probably even more important than the first. And that's the boost to the morale of the soldiers from seeing volunteers coming from all over the country, all over the world actually, to support them. That morale boost is much more valuable than the work that we actually do. So I'd like to tell you a quick story from my book that illustrates that morale boost. In 2006, I was assigned to a paratrooper reservist base near Rehovot, Israel. And I arrived there just at the end of the Second Lebanese War. Soldiers were coming off the fighting front to my base to be demobilized, drop off their equipment, and after a day or 2, go home. So it happened that on one of the early days I was on that base, I sat in the mess hall for lunch with a platoon of soldiers who had just come off the fighting front. And they looked tired. They looked more than tired. They looked exhausted. From 3 weeks of straight fighting, they were just down. They were just slumped over their plates. They were barely able to eat, and they didn't talk to each other. They were just so worn out and down. You could see it in their eyes. And I happened to sit next to their sergeant, who was their best English speaker. And the sergeant asked me, "What are you doing on our base?" And I replied that we were volunteers from around the world who come to show our support for Israel by volunteering on Israeli military bases. And he turned to his soldiers and translated that to them in Hebrew. And all of a sudden, these slumped over, drooped over soldiers perked up excitedly and began talking very fast in very fast Hebrew, which of course I don't understand. And I turned to the sergeant and I said, what are they saying? And the sergeant said, they're saying, hearing this is sweeter than breathing the air. Hearing this is sweeter than breathing the air. That's the positive impact on their morale our presence had. And it's very rewarding to the volunteers to see that positive impact on the morale. It's also very rewarding to the volunteers to receive sort of appreciation from the soldiers. The ones we work side by side with really appreciate it, that we're working side by side with them. And they express it in unusual ways. So I thought I'd tell you another story from my book about how one group of soldiers expressed their appreciation to the volunteers. About 5 years ago, I was assigned to an Air Force base near Tel Aviv. And it was an unusual Air Force base. Let me explain, stepping back. You know the $3 billion of military aid that the US gives to Israel every year? The bulk of that military aid is in the form of aircraft parts because the Israeli Air Force flies US-made planes. So from contractors all over the United States ship airplane parts to Israel, and they all arrive at this one place, the base that I was on. A tremendous volume of material comes in from these defense contractors. So the first week I was on the base with 15, it was a group of about 15 Americans, Canadian volunteers. They announced that the base was so far behind and so backlogged that in week 2, they were going to have to require that the soldiers work a 12-hour shift. And they asked the volunteers, do you want to work your normal 8-hour shift? Or do you want to work the 12-hour shifts that the soldiers are going to work? And we said, of course, if we're working side by side with the soldiers and they work 12 hours, we'll work 12 hours, not a problem. We worked hard through that first week, and by the end of the week, they made a second announcement. And they announced on the base that because of the presence of the volunteers, we worked down the backlog to the point where they could cancel the 12-hour shift. So the volunteers were happy, the soldiers were happier. Then we got into the second week, and we continued to work hard, and we worked down the backlog to the point that they were actually sending the soldiers home early. We had eliminated their backlog. They were going home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, these are soldiers that commute. They live near the base, so they get to go home and see their families. They go home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon instead of the normal 5. And so at one point, I had befriended a soldier, the only American soldier on this Israeli base. He had made Aliyah from Georgia, from the state of Georgia with his family. His name was Joshua, I think. And I asked Joshua, because I trusted him to be candid with me, I said, the soldiers are very nice to us to our face, but can you tell me what they really think about us? What do they say about us behind our back? And he was candid back. He gave me 2 answers. The first answer I've heard from many other soldiers about the volunteers. And he said, we think you're all crazy. Right? He's Georgian. He said, you think you're all crazy. That's the way he framed it. He said, we don't understand why you come here. You leave your comfortable lives in America, your families, you pay money to fly over here to work and sweat on an army base. He said, we have to work and sweat. We're soldiers, we're Israelis. It's required of us, and it's our patriotic duty to do this. So we know why we do this, but we can't understand why you leave behind what you leave behind to come here and do this. So we call you all crazy. That's what he said. Then he hesitated for a minute. He said, well, we call you something else as well, but I have to give you some context before I tell you what it is. He said, you need to understand that this base is like the Amazon.com of the Israeli Air Force. A tremendous volume of material comes into this base every day, and we're just not adequately staffed to handle it. We can't keep up with it. And so we're constantly behind, we're constantly backlogged. They're constantly pulling these 12-hour shifts on us, and the work just is burdensome to the point that it just gets us down. And then you 15 volunteers from Canada and the US show up, and you're all jazzed up to work hard, and you do work hard, and you burn through this backlog to the point that at the end of the second week you're here, you finished all the work. There's no backlog. We get to go home early, an hour early. He says, wow, that never happens on this base. That gives us a precious extra hour with our families and friends that we normally don't have. And so we have a second thing we call you. We call you angels from God. Angels from God. Because you give us a precious hour with our families. So on the one hand, Joshua said, we call you crazy. On the other hand, we call you angels from God. He said, if I were you, I would take it as a compliment. And so we did. And for the third week, I spread that word around to the other volunteers. For the third week, we worked our butts off to make sure that these soldiers could go home an hour early every day, and they loved us for it. So that's an unusual expression of appreciation by the soldiers we worked side by side with. Excuse me, let me take a drink. Now, the volunteers are grouped together in teams by language. So there'll be an English-speaking group of volunteers from English-speaking countries, a German-speaking, a French-speaking, a Russian-speaking. And each team of volunteers is put under the direction of a young soldier, a Sarel soldier, usually a young woman named a Madricha. And these Madrichot are special young women, very, very high caliber soldiers. It's very selective to become a Sarel Madricha. And so I'd like to tell you a story from my book about a Sarel Madricha who has a connection to our Jewish community here in the Triangle. One year, my son and I were assigned to a tank base in the Judean desert, not too far from the Dead Sea. It was summertime, it was hot as hell, and I wouldn't recommend you volunteer in the summertime there. It's just very hot. Anyway, our Madricha was named Rebecca. Rebecca spoke perfect English because she was originally from Houston, Texas. She and her family had made Aliyah to Israel when she was a young girl. Now, the Madrakot's job is to look after the volunteers and make sure that their physical needs are met, that our accommodations are decent, our food is decent, we have the right decent work to do, that sort of thing. But they're also responsible for putting on evening programs. So every evening after work, after dinner, there's an educational program on some aspect of Israel. It could be Israeli geography, history, the military, language, whatever. And the Madrakot are trained on putting on these programs. And occasionally they bring on an outside speaker. So this Madrakot named Rebecca one night brought in an outside speaker. His name was Stephen. Could you put on the next slide, please, Julia? His name is Stephen. And Stephen spoke to us. There's Madrakot Rebecca, and there's Stephen. Stephen spoke to us about his experience as a combat medic in an elite fighting unit in the Second Lebanon War in the mountains of Lebanon, for which he had earned the highest medal that Israel can confer on a soldier for bravery, the equivalent of in the US, the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he explained that he had been a medic in that combat unit for 3 weeks of straight fighting. And it was a terrible, terrible time for him. It was a traumatic time for him, to the point where he suffered from debilitating vomiting and things like that, because you're under fire for 3 weeks in a row. People are shooting at you, rocketing you, bombing you. His job is to try to treat the people who are injured around him. His friends and comrades are getting shot and blown up. And it was very emotional for him. It was emotional for him to talk about it. At times he was able to save the lives of his comrades, and other times they died in his arms and he couldn't save them. And it was an emotional time for him, and it was an emotional time, a thing for him to talk about it. So even speaking about it, he had to stop at certain points and just look up at the ceiling silently and just compose himself. It was so difficult for him to get through this presentation. And yet it seemed therapeutic for him to talk about it. And at the end of the presentation, you could hear a pin drop, and the lights came on, and we turned to Rebecca, and there were tears coming down, streaming down her cheeks. And she explained that Stephen was her brother, and she had never before heard him talk about his experience in Lebanon. And she had another brother who was also in the fighting in Lebanon. And luckily, both brothers survived that war. And Rebecca talked about how difficult it was for she and her mom back home to be waiting to hear whether the two brothers would survive. And her mother still celebrates August 14th, the ceasefire date in that war, as the date when she knew that both of her boys would come home alive. You hear many, many stories about this, like this in Israel, especially when you're volunteering. Oh, and by the way, the connection that Rebecca has to our Jewish community here, when we were leaving, the volunteers were each given a thank you note, a personal thank you note from Rebecca. She put it in a sealed envelope and asked us to open it when we got home. So I did, and that was the first time I found out what her last name was, and it's a very familiar last name to me, Friedland. So I asked my friend Beth Friedland if there was any possibility, I think she's on the Zoom, if there's any possibility that there was a connection. And she said, of course, Rebecca and Stephen are her cousins from Texas who made Aliyah. Small world, small world. And I think there's a resemblance between Beth Friedland and her cousin Rebecca. You can make your own judgment. Okay, could we move on from the slide? We don't need slides up anymore, Julia. I'm going to tell one more story. I think we have time for one more story. And it's about another madrakah, an unusual madrakah. I was assigned to an Air Force base once, and my madrakah was named Carla. Carla had made Aliyah from Argentina with her family shortly before she joined the Army. And when she and her family came to Israel, they didn't come as a group, they came just the immediate family. And they came to Israel not knowing anyone, not having any family, no connections, no nothing. And they felt very much alone and lonely in their strange new land. And Carla went into the Army right away. Carla wanted to be a combat soldier in the worst possible way. And you have to understand, Carla was a very physically large person. She was about 6 foot tall. She was very strongly built. You might call her Zoftic, but strongly built. She had blonde, curly hair, very blue eyes, very fair complexion. She looked almost Scottish, and she wanted to be a combat soldier. So she volunteered for combat duty, went through the training, and made it through the very end of the training. At the very last minute, she got flunked out. And the reason she got flunked out was no fault of her own. It turned out she was allergic to certain plants that were native to Israel that made her sneeze uncontrollably. And you can't have a combat soldier sneezing in situations where combat soldiers have to be quiet. So she flunked out of the training, and she immediately decided to become a Sar al-Madrakah. And in her training to be a Sar al-Madrakah, she met another soldier, a trainee, named Hadar. And Hadar was a physical opposite of Carla. Carla was big, blonde, strong looking, and Hadar was less than 5 feet tall, thin like a rail, and she looked Yemenite. She had very dark features, dark hair, dark eyes, very dark skin. She looked Yemenite. And yet they hit it off. And it was like Mutt and Jeff when you saw them together. I met Hadar. They hit it off and became best of friends. And they hung out together so much that at one point, jokingly, Carla said to Hadar, you know, we spend so much time together that people are going to think we're relatives, that we're related, especially because our last name is the same, Berger. It's a very common last name. I have relatives in Israel named Berger. And Hadar said, yeah, but that couldn't be the case because my grandfather was the only member of his family to have survived the Holocaust from a small village in Poland. And Carla said, that's doubly the case. It couldn't be the case because my grandfather was also the only member of his family to have survived from a small village in Poland. So Carla said to Hadar, just out of curiosity, what was your grandfather's village name? And Hadar answered, Stuchov. And then Hadar said, what was your grandfather's village name? And Carla answered, Stuchov. And it turned out they put two and two together, and the two grandfathers were actually brothers who thought they were the only survivors of their family. So it meant that Carla and Hadar were cousins. And it meant that Carla's family, coming to Israel so much alone, had a very large family in Israel, and there was a very happy reunion of the two branches of family shortly after that. So it's a story with a very happy ending. Speaking of endings, I think it's time to close this presentation. Let me just remind you that my book is called A Passion for Israel, Adventures of a Sorrow Volunteer. It's full of stories of the type I've just told you. I hope it's meant to entertain the reader as well as to educate the reader about Israel. There's a lot of history about recent Israeli history from the 20th and 21st century in there. So I hope you read my book. I hope you enjoy my book, and you might just be tempted to volunteer because of it. And if you are, just know that there are a lot of other people in our Jewish community here locally who've already volunteered. And actually, I'd ask if by a show of hands, could people just wave if they volunteered, and you can get some idea. There are people here, quite a number of people, okay, who volunteered before. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Julia Snyder, our Zoom master, and she will allow you to have a sort of a Q&A or comment session, and she will unmute you as you raise. I don't know, Julia, how do you want to do this?
Yeah,
you want people to raise their hands?
You can physically raise your hand, or you can write something in the chat, and
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody have any questions or comments, just raise your hand or write something in the chat, and she will unmute you.
Beth Friedland said this was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beth. Any other questions? Comments? Saul? Can you unmute Saul?
Yeah. Won't let me unmute. Saul, can you unmute? Yeah.
If you do volunteer, as I did once, the question is, do you have any control over where you might be based? I mean, I was in that medical unit, which was quite interesting. In fact, some of the things I packed actually was sent to Nepal the next year.
Mm-hmm. The answer to the question of whether you have any control over what base you're assigned to, I have no control over the bases they assign me to, but I do think you can state a preference. Doesn't mean you'll get it. The medical supply base is the most frequently used base, so that if you do state a preference for that base, it's called Matzrop, you'll likely get it because there's such a need for volunteers on the base. They can take up to 40 volunteers at a time. Any other questions or comments?
From the chat, Beth Friedland asked, where can we buy your book?
Thanks you, Beth. You can get it on Amazon. It's probably easier to get it on Amazon than a local bookstore.
And Jean and Roger Harris asked if you could hold up the book.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And
Passion for Israel.
Betty said, why did you not mention Bach Sanhanim? I don't know how to pronounce that.
Bach Sanhanim? Okay. Alex is a former paratrooper, and I was on a paratrooper base called Bach Sanhanim, which is an outstanding paratrooper base. There are many good stories from that base. I have a chapter in the book about it, and I just didn't happen to pick a story out from that particular base. Sorry, Alex. Any other questions or comments?
Also from the chat, Rebecca asked, the Triangle community has gotten so much press about their BDS activities. Have you thought about things to do?
Yeah. My book talks a little bit about BDS and the fact that if people went to Israel and saw Israel and learned about Israel, they would reject BDS because BDS talks about how everything's apartheid there and things like that. And if you go and you're on an army base, you see that it's not apartheid. There are Arabs, there are Druze, there are Christians that all mix together on the base. They're not treated differently. And if you're out there on the weekends, you're free on the weekends when you volunteer. And you go into Israeli society, you see it's quite a free society. It's just the opposite of the apartheid that they claim that it is. So by getting to know Israel, you'll get to reject their claims.
Well, some of the BDS organizers have actually been on birthright trips. So yes, they have been to Israel. Yes, they would have seen soldiers on their birthright trip. Birthright does give you a very structured and programmed view of Israel. And many of them may not be interested in going back. And many of the people on the fence may not be interested.
That's a free country. It's their choice.
It's their choice. Yeah. It's their choice. I actually maintain websites that, among other things, promote Israelis as humans so that they don't have to leave the comfort of their home to hear their voices.
Okay.
So yeah, but thank you so much. Very, very good, very interesting, great work.
You're welcome. There's a question here from Sheldon Hamburger. What's the status of the program given Israel's travel lockdown? Right now, Sarel is closed. And there are no volunteers allowed on Israeli military bases in order to protect the soldiers on those bases from COVID. We're hopeful it'll open up in the fall. So, and what we're doing is we're allowing people to register with an indefinite date. So you have to fill out all the forms and go through all the process of registering and being interviewed. And then you're ready to go. And then once it opens up, you just pick a date that you want to go and you can start. Any other questions or comments?
It's Leah Pollack, a fellow volunteer. Mark, again, I enjoyed your first book. I'm enjoying your second book. The presentation was spot on. I even heard from my madracha and the other volunteers, everybody just checking in how people are doing. We had volunteers together from, the UK, from Argentina, from California, from Canada, from Scotland, from Croatia. It was just a really great cross-section of different ages, ranging from 17 to 85. It was a real blessed experience. I went in January this year. I can't believe that's within the same calendar year as today. But it's just, I really will look forward to my next excursion and my next adventure because it was fantastic and continues to enhance my life and my connection. So thank you, Mark, from your speaking of it at Friday night services all the way through to this presentation. Just thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I see there's a comment from Judy Jacobs to talk about the friends you make while you volunteer. That's what Leah basically said. You get to know people from all over the world. I have friends now in New Zealand, South Africa, Milan, any place I go in the world, there are people I know because I made friends on these bases. It's a lot of fun to get to know people from around the world. Other comments or questions?
Someone asked, do college students enjoy trips?
Yes, we have a special college program actually that helps to subsidize their airfare because we understand that for college kids, the hardest part of getting in Israel is paying the airfare. And so we have a separate college program and we've raised some money to help them pay for the airfare and go over there. And they go as a group, so the college kids are together on bases. So they have a good experience.
I wanted to ask, is there an opportunity to mix with the soldiers more than just mixing with the volunteers?
On most bases, yes. On a couple of bases, sometimes no. But on most bases that I've been on, you work side by side with soldiers, or you work under the direction of soldiers. So, and you live in the barracks with the soldiers. You're eating the mess hall with the soldiers. You work side by side with them. There's tons of opportunity to get to know them. The hardest part is they're shy about their English. So the best thing is for you is to approach them and speak with them, and then they'll open up.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much.
You're welcome, Naomi. Other questions or comments?
I also
just
want to say I enjoyed it very much, and I think it's a great way, an imaginative way a different way to volunteer. Many people volunteer at a kibbutz in a limited fashion, which is less specialized. This one, I think, gives you a particular look at Israel culture, but especially over a period of 18 years, I want to commend you for staying with it. And the continuity is a wonderful aspect of your experience.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Other comments or questions?
Someone asked in the comments, I understand it's possible to do Sorrel as an add-on to Birthright. Is that?
That's correct. You can, and I've served with some college kids who've done Birthright and then stay, as long as they're there, because their effort is paid for, they go on and spend a week or two on an Army base. It's one of the what are called Birthright extension options that's available. Other comments or questions?
Someone else asked, how are the candidates vetted?
There is a vetting process because this is an Army base and we need to be careful. You go through an interview process. I'm the local interviewer here in Raleigh. And you have to have a medical form filled out and signed by your doctor that says you're capable of doing some basic things like walking a mile on uneven surfaces and lifting 20 pounds over your head, which shouldn't be hard. We ask that you be reasonably physically fit. We don't want people who are on walkers or canes or severe asthmatics or anything like that, so as not to burden the base. So there is a vetting process that we go through. And then we send the names to Israel and they go through a process as well. So if people want to sign up, they need to sign up, I'd say at least 3 months in advance. Other comments or questions? Okay. Thank you very much for your patience, your attention, and I hope you read my book. I hope you enjoy my book. And I welcome any comments you have afterwards. If you want to email me, you probably all have my email address. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Bye.